is important to learn how to talk with your children about your diagnosis and how to continue to parent with ALS. My name is Michelle Barrios, and I am the Community Education Specialist at MDA. We are thrilled to have you join us today for this important and educational webinar. The webinar today is part of our larger MDA Engage flagship community event series, which focuses on bringing the neuromuscular disease community together around education and resources. Be sure to visit the MDA Engage section on mda.org for updates on upcoming virtual education events. We are recording today's event and will be posting it to the mda.org website for on-demand viewing to ensure that those who are not able to join us live today are able to access this information. Please know that all phone lines have been muted. We will be having a question and answer session towards the end of the webinar. Please be sure to utilize the Q&A window to type in your questions. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, a tray of webinar icons will appear. Click on the Q&A bubble to open the window and enter your question. You do not need to wait until the Q&A session to chat in your questions. As questions come up along the webinar, please feel free to send those in. Before we begin, I would like to say thank you to our speakers, whom you will meet shortly. I would also like to thank our event supporters, Cytokinetics, and Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America. We would not be able to provide community education webinars like this if not for their generous support, so thank you very much. For over 70 years, MDA has led the way in accelerating research, advancing care, and advocating for the support of our families. MDA's mission is to empower people living with muscular dystrophy, ALS, and related neuromuscular diseases to live longer, more independent lives. Now let's review the objectives for today's webinar. Attendees will learn how to talk to your children about an ALS diagnosis, how to continue parenting while living with ALS, and a child's needs during a parent's ALS journey. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Archana Basu is a psychologist in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and a research scientist in the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Basu works with children and families to promote coping and resilience in the context of adversities such as bereavement, trauma, or neglect. Using a developmental lens, her research aims to understand how protective factors, like sensitive caregiving, shape children's development in the context of adversities. Dr. Cindy Moore is the Associate Director of Massachusetts General Hospital Cancer Center's Marjorie E. Korf Parenting at Challenging Time PACT program, and an Assistant Professor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School. She joined the PACT program in 2003 and since then has provided parent guidance to hundreds of adults with cancer. In 2018, she helped expand the PACT program to serve parents treated in the MGH Healy Center for ALS. In addition to parent guidance, she provides psychotherapy to children and adults with a particular focus on bereavement and has training in complicated grief therapy. She teaches locally and nationally about how parents and healthcare professionals can support children living with a chronically ill parent, conducts research on the challenges faced by parents who are managing cancer, and supervises psychology trainees. And with that, I would like to turn over the webinar to Dr. Moore.
Hello, I'm going to share my screen. All right, is that working?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic, okay. So first off, neither Dr. Basu or I have any financial disclosures to make. So Michelle, thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting us to talk today about supporting adults with us who have children. For this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about parents, but this word really includes any adult providing regular care to a child. And these days, that's really often a grandparent. So this talk is aimed at those other caregiving adults as well as parents. Facing a serious illness prompts us to rethink priorities, and often spending time with family moves very high on the list. And throughout our time with the ALS PACT program, Dr. Basu and I have been so impressed with the flexibility and balance and strength that parents demonstrate in the course of living with ALS. But there are some incredibly rough days and weeks. We have a couple of goals for today's webinar. One is to talk briefly about the ways that we know ALS affects parents and children. And second is to identify some ways that parents can support their children's resilience that we hope will be useful to you and your family. So first, to round out our introduction a little bit more, Archana and I are part of the ALS Multidisciplinary Clinic at Mass General. We're both psychologists, as Michelle shared, and together we comprise the ALS PACT program team. And PACT is Parenting at a Challenging Time. Our mission in the program is to recognize and address the parenting concerns of adults with ALS and to collaborate with them to help their children thrive throughout the challenges of living with ALS and a family member. We work to identify and build on families' existing strengths, like lessons learned from experiences of coping with other challenges in the past, or strengths like humor, or being able to cooperate together, or strong connections to a larger community. And we try to work with parents to help choose ways to talk about ALS that will help children develop a clear narrative about the changes that they're seeing and living with. Our approach provides indirect support to children in that we're not providing therapy to children or even typically meet with children. Instead, we're offering psychoeducational parent guidance consultations to people being cared for in the MGH ALS clinic. And we're available on an as-needed basis to those parents or grandparents of infants through emerging adults. So we think of children in their mid-20s as emerging adults. And we talk with co-parents as well if the patient is comfortable with that. Some people appreciate just a single consult. Others have spoken with us multiple times over many, many months. And we receive funding from the ALS Center and are also really fortunate to benefit from philanthropic donations. So we've been privileged to talk with quite a few parents and grandparents over the last several years and have heard about many ways that ALS changes parents and changes parenting. When an illness affects parenting, there are, of course, ripple effects for the whole family, including children and even grandchildren. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that ALS brings a variety of physical, cognitive, and emotional challenges. Really, I think every parent experiences some emotional distress. Some will even experience depression. Studies of people with other life-threatening medical illnesses have found that those who are parenting dependent children have increased vulnerability to depression compared to patients without children at home. And all of these changes can affect the ways that parents and children interact together, how they play and what activities are possible, and how parents and children also communicate together. A child's usual responses or ways of interacting with parents can also be affected by changes that the child observes. So for example, many children will take on new caregiving roles in response to physical changes in a parent. Some children can feel that they're somehow to blame for a parent's depressed mood, and they might pull back from interacting in their usual ways. Most parents we talk with have concerns from the start about how ALS might affect their children, and these change over time depending on how children seem to be reacting. So a parent may notice that their child seems less eager to spend time together than they did before and feel kind of concerned about their child's mood. And children can then react to whatever way the parents share their concerns, maybe by sharing their own worries with parents, or maybe by feeling kind of guilty. All of this can change what it feels like to be a parent. Research has shown that a number of parents feel a mix of grateful and guilty about their children's caregiving roles. Parenting can feel less enjoyable, more stressful, and it can just feel impossible to be the parent you want to be or used to be. Being a mother or father or a grandparent is usually a huge part of our identities. So when it doesn't feel like it's going well, it's really painful. What I hope you take away from today's webinar is a sense that even though there's so much about ALS that you can't control, there are ways to make a difference in your children's experience of it. This can happen through the ways adults pay attention to children's experiences and how they interact with children. I also want to underscore the point that children's well-being is closely connected to parents' well-being. So the good news here is that any investment you make in caring for yourself is also an investment in your children. ALS certainly creates a difficult set of challenges and concerns for adults. So how about for children? There are really only a few small studies of children who have a parent with ALS, but there is a bigger research literature on the impact of chronic parental illness on children and families. And those include studies with cancer, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's, as well as the few with ALS. And really, it all seems to point to pretty similar conclusions about how children are affected by parental illness. So it's common for children to take on new roles. They may help keep a parent company, for example, by reading out loud, or help a parent pick things up, or get dressed, or manage electronics, or do some cooking. And some kinds of helping can allow children to become more mature. They are learning new skills, and they often feel really proud of their competence, and also feel closer to the parent by being able to help that way. Sometimes, though, expectations can be too high, or the new responsibilities might make a child feel kind of isolated from friends, or they might put pressure on children that takes away from their ability to develop as we'd hope, at school or with athletics, with friends. It's not always obvious what's age appropriate and reasonable for a particular child, and it certainly depends on the child. But talking with children about their roles is a good way to start to figure this out. Other good news is that most children do not develop serious mental health problems in response to a parent's illness. In other words, they don't meet criteria to be diagnosed with something like depression or an anxiety disorder. But a number of children will experience either new or increases in emotional distress. That could include feelings of sadness or anxiety or irritability. So it is important to monitor children for symptoms of depression and anxiety. Children can have thoughts that are intrusive or preoccupying, that they kind of have a hard time getting out of their heads, including worries about the parent or about themselves. The most common worries depend partly on the child's developmental stage, as well as the communication among family members, and of course, what's visible about the illness. But children might have concerns about family finances, about getting sick themselves, maybe mistakenly through contagion with younger children or because of genetic risk. They might be concerned about what friends will think in any given situation. They might be concerned about losing the parent. And children can also have very egocentric concerns, like, can we go shopping for my new cleats because I need them tonight? And it's pretty normal, even though it can feel selfish and kind of difficult to respond to sometimes. Children may also have physical or somatic symptoms. Sometimes those can match the parent's symptoms. Frequently, it's a headache or a stomach ache. Children might have behavior changes like social withdrawal or declines in academic performance. Sometimes they have lower self-esteem, and sometimes they have relationship difficulties. So, for example, feeling disconnected from friends who don't understand their experience. Oops, sorry. So now I want to talk about how we can support the emotional health and resilience of children. To do that, I think it helps to define resilience, which is a word we've heard a lot during the pandemic. You've probably heard resilience described as the ability to bounce back after a challenge. And that's partly true, but it kind of makes it sound like people won't be changed at all by the experience, which is really pretty much impossible. We know that everyone in a family will be changed by living with ALS. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child developed this illustration of resilience, which I really like, minus the bigger boxes over the scale, which are my addition. Protective experiences and coping skills on one side counterbalance significant adversity on the other. And resilience means that a child's health and development tip toward positive outcomes, even when there's a heavy load of factors stacked on the negative outcome side. So in the case of parental ALS, children usually do experience distress about different aspects of a parent's illness, and that experience can add weight to the left side of the scale. But we'd say children are resilient when, despite adversity, they continue to meet developmental milestones in terms of social, emotional, and cognitive development. For example, we want children to feel connected to parents and peers, to continue to learn and develop a range of skills and relationships. People aren't born with resilience. It's not a trait like brown hair or left-handedness. A person might show resilience in some situations, but not in others. But there are ways to develop resilience over time and to increase the likelihood of positive outcomes for both children and adults. The gray box above the left-hand side of the scale represents one of the risk factors for children's poorer adjustment that I usually try to mention, and that's depression or anxiety in either parent or caregiver. So it's another reminder that taking care of your own emotional health really is an investment in your children. The green box above the right-hand side of the scale shows some of the keys to helping tip the scale toward positive outcomes for children. And I'm going to give away the punchline right away. The most important factor for growing resilience in children is having at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent or caregiver or other adult. But then there are specific elements of those relationships that can tip the scale toward positive outcomes, and I want to talk about those next. There are 5 areas we try to help parents focus on in supporting their children. These are warmth, family cohesion, a sense of control, connections with others outside the family, and communication. So warmth is pretty self-explanatory. It really is about affection and support, making sure that your children feel that their needs matter, that they're loved. Unfortunately, when we're stressed, it can be pretty easy to come across just as irritated or worn out. So finding even small ways to express warmth and love will help children. And that might be with physical affection, loving words, showing up to cheer them on, or helping them feel that someone's on their side. What do I mean by cohesion? That's the feeling that your family is pulling together, that you're all part of the same team, even though there might be infighting among the players sometimes. I'll share a couple of examples of things that seem to increase family cohesion. The first is pretty much of a no-brainer. It's enjoyable family time or parent-child time. But ALS can make it impossible to have fun in the same ways that you always have in the past. So it can help to admit that everyone is sad about what can't be done anymore, that in fact you're all grieving. And acknowledging that can sometimes make it a little easier to be able to explore new possibilities. So maybe there's a TV show that the family can watch regularly and create a ritual around it. So having snacks, a blanket, having phones off. Maybe with a younger child, you listen to a recorded book together instead of reading aloud yourself. And sometimes ALS-focused activities, like doing fundraising activity together, can also be good ways to build cohesion. You might have already noticed in your family that having a parent with ALS doesn't make kids automatically thrilled about family time. They still won't always want to participate. And that can be frustrating, even painful for parents who might want to soak in every possible minute with children. Sometimes children feel that kind of intensity and need breaks from it. Sometimes they just crave time with friends. That's really normal. And sometimes it's sad for them to accept changes in a parent. And so they might pull back to make it a little easier to compartmentalize. You can try being curious about their reluctance and be clear that it's important to you that they have family time together, but try not to say things that make children feel guilty. Another ingredient in family cohesion is the idea of family identity. So like, what is your team about? What matters to you as a group? Can you find a family identity that's more than, we're the family with the really crummy luck whose mom has ALS? For some families, that can be something like telling the best jokes or being really creative together or hosting great online game nights. There's interesting research on how children who hear family stories, either from earlier generations, from their parents' lives when they were younger, seem to adapt better to adversity. We don't really know why this is, but we do also know that family stories that follow what's called an oscillating narrative, so ups and downs, are especially helpful. So those are stories that acknowledge that sometimes things were getting better and better for your family, that, the successes were building. Sometimes there were periods where things fell apart or people made mistakes, even bad mistakes. But through it all, there have been things that really mattered to the family and held them together. I have a colleague at Mass General, Dr. Ann Fischel, and she's a family therapist who's really passionate about improving the family dinner experience. She's written some conversation starters and contributed them to a website that I'm going to share in the resources later on. And I think it's helpful for ideas in getting kids to talk around the dinner table. And all of that can help with the feeling of being on the same team. Another way to increase children's resilience is by providing them with a sense of control. So that feeling of being captain of your own ship. And there are plenty of ways to do this too, many more than what I've listed, but here's a start. Having information can, of course, increase anyone's sense of control. That's probably a big part of why many of you are part of MDA and here today. A specific example might be having clear plans about who would care for your child in case of an emergency, like if you had to go to the hospital suddenly. You can increase your children's sense of control if you write the plan down and share it with them. I remember a little boy with food allergies who really needed to know that the neighbor who would care for him would know what foods he couldn't eat if he ever had to go over there. His mom had it covered. She'd made a list for the neighbor, but he didn't know it. And so make your children, be aware of the ways that people are trying to make things safe for them. Even when things are changing quickly or there's uncertainty, try to look for places where children can make choices about things that affect them. You might decide that helping out at home is not optional for your kids, but you could talk about whether your child would prefer helping out a few minutes every day, or maybe for a longer chunk of time, once or twice a week. Would they rather remember a set list of chores every week, or agree that for 15 minutes a day, they'll be ready and willing to help with whatever you might need at the moment? Stable routines also give many of us a sense of control and aren't just for little kids. meals, bedtime, one-on-one time with each other, also consistent expectations for children. They all make life feel more predictable and help children feel safer. Children can also gain a sense of control from being reminded of the successes they've had in the past and coping strategies that they've used. Things like being able to persevere and learn the times tables, or having a wicked sense of humor, or teenagers being willing to ask for help when he started failing chemistry. With all of that, you're encouraging your child to think, okay, this is hard, but I've done other hard things. I can do this. And then finally, accepting that a lot is out of our control is part of the picture too. When you're dealing with a condition like ALS, you might want to help your children grow up extra fast, to prepare them for everything that might be coming in the future, and to make sure you teach them all you possibly can. The hard part about this is it can lead to a lot of pressure in the relationship. Kids tend to resist these kinds of preparations, even when they're really well-intentioned. It can help to remind yourself that acorns need time to become trees, and that children feel more in control when they're not feeling so rushed to hurry and grow up. There are a variety of connections with other people that can help tip that resilience scale to better outcomes also. So as parents, you may be looking for ways to get support, but not want to feel that every social interaction you have is focused on ALS. Having someone to organize people who want to support you but aren't really sure what would be truly useful can be helpful. We've nicknamed this role the captain of kindnesses. At some point, you might also want to appoint a press secretary, people who you'll update, who can then update other people in your network so you don't have to spend so much time sharing information. For your children, try to build and nurture their connections with trustworthy adults. So adults who know you well or who know your child well. Both offer different benefits. Doing this, you're letting your children know that it's not disloyal for them to attach to other people. And often children don't trust that without hearing it directly from a parent. You might also connect children to peers with shared experiences. Sometimes school guidance counselors will do a lunch bunch and bring children together who have had some similar experience. There's also an organization called Hope Loves Company that's dedicated to helping connect children affected by ALS. And their website is also on the resources page. This is not for everyone. For some children, hearing about someone else's parent whose ALS is further progressed might be upsetting. For others, it might help them feel better understood. So you really have to gauge for your own child. And last, I did want to touch briefly on professional support. We don't think that every child with a medically ill parent has to have a therapist, but some do. Some of the red flags I'd look for include changes in a child's mood or behavior or just functioning and at home or at school for more than a few weeks, or symptoms getting worse in children who were already dealing with some kind of mental health challenge. If a child asks to see a counselor, I think it's worth pursuing. Sometimes the child will do or say something that raises concerns about their safety. And in that case, you'd want an urgent evaluation at a hospital emergency department or maybe your pediatrician's office if they're available. Referrals, for therapy can be very hard to come by, especially lately. So it is important to be persistent, to ask to be put on wait lists, and to use multiple sources to look for referrals. I've listed a few here. Your child's pediatrician might even have someone in their office who provides some mental health care. Your insurance company might have a list of therapists who are on their panel. Schools might know of local therapists who work with children. There's also an online database called Psychology Today Find a Therapist that allows you to search in your area with a variety of filters. And also your friends may be a source of ideas. And the Find a Therapist website, I'll share in the resources as well. So last but definitely not least, communication can make a big difference in children's resilience. Open, honest, and age-appropriate communication is hugely helpful in supporting children's adjustment to a parent's illness. Open communication with your children might be about explaining the changes they see, might include encouraging questions, helping them share their concerns so they're not worrying alone, and also talking about children's emotions. Parents have told us about a number of obstacles to communication about their medical illnesses. Parents understandably don't want to distress children. That's probably the top concern. Some parents worry about throwing off a child's academic or social progress. Sometimes this is more of an issue of timing. So one parent was ready to talk about his ALS diagnosis, but decided to delay the conversation until after his college student had gotten through her final exams. Some parents worry that sharing anything ever might really throw a child into a tailspin that they won't recover from. Many acknowledge that they're just really frightened of talking about death. And parents often share that communicating feels like a tricky balancing act between saying too much and too little. And most often, I think people bend over backward not to share too much. But when a parent has a serious illness like ALS, it's important that the family find ways to talk about it and the changes it creates, and also talk about the family's ongoing adjustment to all the changes. How's everyone doing with it? Ideally, the communication will be two ways. So parents are aware of children's needs and reactions throughout the parent's illness, and also so children aren't worrying alone. We know that children frequently overhear information, even when adults are being super careful, and are also just really good at sensing adults' worry. They have antennae that are, up for that most of the time. In an information vacuum, children can create their own explanations for confusing or stressful events, but their explanations will probably be incorrect in some way and can leave them confused or feeling surprised by ongoing changes. So we would like conversations to give children time to ask questions, to understand and adjust to what's happening, and also prepare for the future, and to feel heard, understood, and included. And particularly with teenagers, open communication models that your family can talk about even hard things. So hopefully sometime when a teen has awkward or maybe difficult news to share, that example will encourage them to be brave enough to do it. So the why of open communication is about developing a clear, shared family narrative about what's happening so that everyone in the family can anticipate and plan for and understand changes. In terms of how you approach this, there are some things to keep in mind. First is that you may need to start conversations rather than waiting for your children to ask questions. There are a lot of reasons that kids won't ask about changes, other than that they're just oblivious or unaffected or don't care. It's really not ideal for children to learn about hard news by overhearing conversations. It sends the message that the child shouldn't ask questions, maybe even that the child isn't trusted with the information. And again, as I mentioned, if the child's overhearing a one-sided conversation, that can lead to all kinds of misinterpretations. It's helpful to predict the most likely near-term physical changes that children will observe, and that can help them prepare. It also helps children of all ages when you talk directly about any effects on their own lives and how you'll manage those together. So for example, how a child might get to school if a parent stops driving. It's important to talk about emotions, both yours and your children's. Sometimes when kids are really upset, we just want so much to alleviate their distress that we move very quickly to solve the problem or find a bright side, or even, tell them not to cry because things will be okay. And problem solving or just finding hope in a challenging situation is a hallmark of resilience, but it needs to be paired with naming and validating a wide range of feelings, and even letting children know that you share some of the same feelings. You might talk about the healthy ways you're coping with your own difficult emotions. That's a way children can learn. It may not be appropriate to talk about all of your own feelings, but naming some of what you're feeling, whether it's sad about changes or disappointed about things you can't do, or grateful for family and friends. Naming those feelings shows your child that feelings are part of the whole picture and matter to you. And showing what you believe rather than just telling a child is much more powerful. You want children to know that you don't want them to worry alone, and to really feel that you understand their feelings. You'll probably have conversations as a family when there are updates to provide. And afterward, it's a good idea to follow up with each of your children individually, ideally during their most open times. So for some kids, that's in the car. For some, it's at bedtime. Sometimes it's, being out on a walk together. Early on, let them know that you hope they'll share anything they hear about ALS from anyone else, so you can be sure they're getting accurate information, which doesn't always happen. So many people don't know very much about ALS. For children who aren't big talkers, or who may be holding back to protect you from their worries, try to work together to figure out if there are other adults who might be able to check in with your child. Could be an aunt or uncle, could be a coach, could be a teacher, but really try to think with your child about who they'd feel comfortable with. If children have questions at any point, try to answer honestly, but also take your time. First, figure out what they're really asking. For example, if a teenager asks how long you're going to keep working, is she wondering about how fast you expect any physical changes to happen? Or maybe about whether her college fund will get spent on other things? Sometimes you can open that up by responding with something like, that's a great question. What got you wondering about that? Sometimes parents in our consults appreciate hearing some examples of how conversations might go, something a little more concrete than the general principles I've shared here. So I'm going to give a few examples of what it could sound like to talk directly about these things. There's in no way are we implying that there's one right way to talk about any of this. There's certainly not. It depends on your family style, your children's ages and temperaments, and lots of other things. But sometimes having examples gives you something to tweak and then fit to your own needs. So just starting the conversations can feel quite awkward. One way in can be to ask your children what they've noticed is different about you or your partner. Or if they've already mentioned a change or asked about a change, to follow up and find out if they've noticed other things too. You can then summarize and validate their observations. That could sound like, yes, so you've noticed that I've had a few falls and I got some scrapes and bruises. Or you've noticed that mom has been coughing at meals and last night she almost choked. Or you've noticed that dad is getting out of breath easily. Children won't always connect the changes that they see to the progression of ALS, partly because of their cognitive level, but partly just because ALS can create so many different kinds of symptoms that don't, on the face of it, seem to go together in any easy to understand way. So it can be really helpful for parents to make those connections explicit. So, for example, I've been falling because ALS has made the muscles in my legs and feet weaker, so it's easier for me to trip. Or the muscles in mom's throat are weaker because of ALS, so it makes it harder to swallow and food can sometimes get stuck. Or ALS is making it hard for the muscles in dad's chest to expand and contract so that he can breathe in and out normally. You might know something about how these symptoms will be managed. So depending on the child's age, you can describe something about what you think will happen next. I'm going to keep wearing my foot brace, but I'm also going to start carrying a cane. Or my physical therapist thinks it's time for me to order a wheelchair. I don't need it yet, but they can take a while to arrive. And I want to be prepared and be able to get around if my walking gets worse. Or it's important for mom to eat and drink, but eating is taking a lot of time and food is getting stuck, as we saw last night. She's decided to get a feeding tube. And this is something that allows a liquid with the calories and nutrients she needs to go right to her stomach without having to swallow. She can still sit with us at dinner, but she might start choosing softer foods that will go down more easily when she wants to eat something. Or because it's been harder for dad to breathe, he's going to start using a machine at night that will help with that. Or if it's an older child, you can say a machine that will help maintain a good balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in his lungs. It's called a BiPAP machine, and we can show you how it looks and works if you want. Worrying about how to answer a child who asks if a parent could die is really stressful, and there's not a right answer that fits every situation. I know that addressing such a complicated question in a brief talk with no opportunity for individual follow-up might leave some of you feeling really unsatisfied. But we're including it because it comes up so often in our conversations with parents. And I hope it can be helpful to hear how open communication might sound in different ways, even about the hardest topics. We know that parents are looking for a balance. On the one hand, trying not to make any unkeepable promises. On the other hand, trying not to take away all remaining hope for anyone. And I think most parents are intuitively trying to balance and blend honesty with hope. That will sound different in different situations. So for example, a parent might say, well, there's not a cure for ALS, but I'm not planning to die for a long, long time. Another parent might say, people do die from ALS, but there's a lot my doctors and I can do to try to manage it, and I'm doing everything I possibly can. Another option might be, there's no treatment that will take ALS away, but I'm working to live with it as well as I can for as long as I can. Someone with more progression might say, no one thinks I'll die this week or this month, but I am very sick and I'm trying to prepare. Mom or I will let you know if it seems like I could die soon. Or ALS is affecting Dad's breathing so much that I'm not sure he'll live much longer. I'm trying to make the most of every day with him. We really can't promise children that no one will ever die, but we can look for ways to create zones of safety that allow children to be a little less vigilant about that for some period of time. And even when that's not really possible because time might be quite short, it can be really a gift to children when parents are willing to talk about that and then be part of actively supporting them as they're beginning to adjust to that possibility. Most people with a life-threatening illness don't think about it the same way every day. There may be days where people are accepting that time could be much shorter than they'd ever thought, and other days where that's just unimaginable. And people are also very different in how much they think about the future and plan for it. So the idea of considering legacy leaving is not for everyone, but it is meaningful to some parents and to their children, so I'm going to touch on it now as well. Sometimes parents will plan to leave children a gift that's an enduring symbol of love. And it might also be a way to symbolize family values or family history. So I've heard about children receiving jewelry that has a special significance in the family, or a favorite family cookbook, or once a lucky fishing rod. Some parents will write letters to their children, and the letters can allow children to see themselves through the parent's eyes, and also to know the parent more as a person, to hear about values and victories that the parents had. I had the opportunity to speak with young adults, some young adults who had received letters like these, and they commented on how much they appreciated the parents talking about their strengths, and also reading about the parents' memories with the child that the parent really appreciated. Parents will often write about their hopes for their children, which can also be really meaningful to read. It's worth, though, being careful that any hopes aren't so specific that a child would feel that they let their parent down if the future didn't unfold exactly as they described. So it's probably better to talk about hoping a child finds a career that allows them to express their deep caring for other people, rather than saying, I hope you become a doctor someday. If there's been conflict in your relationship, it can be very comforting for children to read that, the parents love them anyway, and also trusted that the child loved them back. And sometimes parents will try to identify other adults who have known them well at different stages of their lives and ask them to be available to the child in the future, or even to reach out to the child in the future to answer questions about the parent. And we have kind of nicknamed that a living legacy. None of this is ever required. I think sometimes I'm hearing that parents feel quite a bit of pressure, especially to write something, but again, it's not for everyone. Before we wrap up and move to the Q&A, I just want to quickly mention a project that Archana and I are working on now, something that we hope can benefit a lot of families coping with ALS. We were fortunate to receive a grant from the ALS Finding a Cure Foundation to create some written resources for parents focused on addressing children's concerns about different experiences with a parent's ALS. And these will be made freely available online for anyone to download, and will also be translated into Spanish. We're also working on materials to help explain the challenges of ALS for community mental health clinicians who may not know very much about it. And then also on some information about supporting children's resilience for clinicians who are already working in multidisciplinary ALS clinics. And we'll certainly let MDA know when these are available. And finally, here are a few resources that I referenced that I'm hoping might be new to you, at least some of them. You'll notice that most of these are not ALS specific. We've included some resources that are more focused on family communication and coping. And we have a PDF of this list that Michelle has, and I think she can email it out after today's webinar if you're interested. So no need to write these down. So again, thank you for the invitation, and I guess we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you so much, Archana, for writing in a little bit in the chat. I know that these conversations can sometimes be difficult, so we appreciate you having some ideas and thought starters on how to have these conversations. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A bubble. Click on the bubble and type in your question. Let me stop this share here. I see some questions in the chat already. So we did have a question about whether this will be recorded. Yes, it's being recorded and will be available on mda.org. Everybody who registered today will be receiving a link to the video along with the resources list that Cindy and Archana have sent over. Here is another question. What if my children already started asking others about what's going on with me?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess I'd be curious first about who the others are. Encourage them to come to you with questions, because ALS is different for everybody, and there's no one who will have better information about how things are unfolding for you, than you, and maybe the other people in your family. Now, Archana, do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I agree, Cindy. I think I agree. I would begin by wondering about some of the questions that you noted, and actually just wanted to just add that we do find this. It's not uncommon for this to happen, especially with some older children, teenagers in particular. So this does come up with some frequency. And I think often may stem both from trying to understand what is happening in terms of what they're observing, but also a wish to maybe protect their parents from the worry or the potential discomfort of having to explain in the conversation. So I think being curious, as Cindy noted, is a great place to start.
Yeah.
Cindy and Archana, can you hear me? I'm having a little bit of trouble with my screen. It's a little frozen. So if you see any other questions in the chat, do you mind just kind of reading them out, or in the Q&A? I'm glad you can still hear me.
Yep.
Thank you.
You do look frozen, but yep, we hear you fine.
Okay,
So, yep,
perfect.
We'll take a look at the chat now.
Thank you.
I see one about early on, how can I explain about my condition in a way they can understand? It's hard to tell them, hard to know how to tell them now that they're asking questions. Arsha, do you want to start on that one? I can jump in.
Sorry, Cindy, I was trying to look for the question that you.
It was up at the top. Just how do we explain to children about the condition? It's, you know, it of course depends on how old children are, and yes. You know, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I found it. Yes, you know, Cindy sort of gave some, you know, range of examples and just to reiterate these points that she sort of highlighted throughout, I think, is that I think a lot of this depends on, first and foremost, I think the children's ages. I think the language we use and even the level of detail, in part because, you know, older children, including adolescents and young adults, will often have a lot of information already just simply by going online sometimes. So I think this is very age dependent, in addition to other factors that you know, Cindy had highlighted. It's your family's personal kind of style, maybe temperamental or personality differences of the children. I think that blend of being open in terms of describing some specifics and being transparent, but also balancing it with what is happening right now and what to expect in the near future is always, is generally a good place to start. I think hearing from the children, I think this was something that was on our slides, you know, asking about what they might have observed, what they might have heard, and even thinking about what they might have read online. I mean, we know, for instance, one of the things is that the trajectory for ALS can look very different. And online, there are a lot of aggregate statistics. And so talking about what those statistics represent and ways in which your own personal trajectory can look very different. And so asking questions of you might be the best sort of source of information of what your family might experience. I think the only other thing I would add, and I don't know, I won't go into too much detail, but Cindy had some great examples of very specific language and questions we can use. We also sometimes, you know, especially for younger children, at times offer some language around analogies that can help them understand ALS. And so, you know, there are examples that we have used, for example, of a house. And just thinking about, you know, just like when you put a switch on, the electricity runs through the wires and, you know, the light comes on. And that's one that's sort of similar to how the brain communicates with different, you know, body parts. And in this, you know, condition, that communication is not working quite as well. So the signals from the brain to the different body parts are not going as quickly as they should be. So that is sort of one very brief snapshot of how we might, so we have some other examples like that for younger children too that we use. I'll pause there. Cindy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. No, I agree with all that you said. And I guess was also thinking of, you know, kind of the really concrete ways that sometimes it's helpful to describe what is happening with ALS. And, you know, just following up, Archana, on your example, even something as simple as, you know, letting younger children know, you know, in our bodies, we, you know, in our heads, we have a brain, and it's the brain that makes decisions for us and tells our body what to do. When I want to pick something up, it's my brain that tells my hand to do that. there are connections between my brain and all my body parts. And ALS is a disease that that destroys those connections. And so even though I'm thinking what I want my hand to do, my brain can't communicate in the same way that it normally would. So again, depending on the age of the child, something like that might also be helpful.
Yeah. Cindy and Archana, talking about age, what about that teenage phase, you know, into puberty, pre-puberty, when attitudes are a little higher and maybe temperament is a little higher as well? How do you have those conversations with teenagers?
I think one of the great things about teenagers is, you know, one of the benefits and one of the challenges is that they're able to think about hypotheticals, and that makes them sometimes argumentative about a lot of things. But they can understand things more abstractly. And that means that they're more capable of worrying about things the way adults do. So I think part of talking to teenagers is recognizing that shift in their thinking. I think it's also recognizing that teenagers can vary a great deal day to day. So, you know, when they're feeling sort of safe and comfortable, their thinking ability and their ability to be, you know, helpful and empathic can be at a very high level. And other times, you know, when they're not, they can come across as very, very selfish. You know, I remember a mom talking to me about how this was a mom with cancer, but I think the point still works, that she came home from the hospital one day and her daughter had cleaned the whole house with Lysol because she was worried about controlling germs. And then a few days later, her daughter was leaving dirty dishes everywhere. And it was so, she couldn't figure out why, you know, how on one day she could be so on top of things and then not. So I feel like with teenagers, it's kind of an ability to roll with that variability in how they respond, and to try hard to meet them where they are.
I unfortunately still can't. I don't know if I can have any more questions come in. I'm still frozen. I'm glad we're still here, thankfully, and we haven't disconnected, but I'm still frozen. If any other questions come in.
I'm just looking now. Let me see. I think
I see a question in the Q&A. I'll just read that out. Are there any books that are good to share with children about ALS? Something written for their age and level of understanding?
There's yes, and now I wish I had included this on the resources page. It's the ALS Association, right, Archana?
Yeah.
I think it's Melinda Kavanagh who wrote. It's kind of a extended pamphlet almost, with some illustrations, cartoons, and there are, I think, 3 different levels: one for younger children, one for slightly older, and then one for teenagers, young adults, I think. And that talks about you know, the experience of having a parent with ALS, and I think it can still be found on the ALS Association page, though I did kind of go looking for it recently and I had to dig to find it. But that's I think the best thing that I've seen. Archana, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I was thinking of the same resource. I think the only other resource, but it is not ALS specific, we have that, and Cindy had that on her, you know, resource list, and you'll receive that as a PDF, is the book that Dr. Paula Rausch has written, and that's not ALS specific, but it does talk a little bit more in detail about the different developmental stages and ages of children and what that means cognitively and emotionally. So I think there are some valuable resources there. And it looks like we have Lana has offered some resources in the chat for everyone. And actually, we would welcome hearing from others if you have across resources that you have found helpful, you know.
Yeah. And your review, or ones that you haven't found helpful for that matter. Also helpful to know about.
Also helpful to know, yes. Yes. I think the ALS Association booklets that Lana, you mentioned, the Real Kids Talk about ALS, that might have been the same series. I'm not totally.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And the ALS experience, it's different and hard for teens. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Archana and Cindy. I'm not sure if we have any more questions because I'm still frozen, but we are closing up the hour. So I would like to thank you so much today for your presentation. We appreciate your time and your expertise and everything you do for the neuromuscular community. So thank you so much. Do you have any last thoughts or anything you'd like to say before we conclude the presentation?
It's just a privilege to be part of your work. So thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you so much for being a part of it. We would also like to thank our webinar supporters, Cytokinetics and Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America. We would love to hear your comments about this webinar. Once the webinar is over, a screen will pop up with the survey. If you could please fill it out, we would really appreciate it. If anyone has questions after this webinar, please feel free to email them to mdaengage@mdausa.org, and we will follow back up with you. If you are new to MDA through this program and are diagnosed with a neuromuscular disease under MDA's umbrella, or are a loved one of someone who is diagnosed, we encourage you to stay engaged with MDA. You can do this by visiting mda.org/join and completing a short form. This will keep you up to date on the latest information and education to help keep families informed in the neuromuscular community. This concludes today's MDA Engage webinar, ALS, Parenting at Challenging Times. Thank you very much for attending and have a great rest of your day.